Welcome to Practicing with Purpose for Lawyers Only. And today we're going to be talking about a passion for peacemaking with Douglas Noll. So welcome, Doug. It's great to have you here.
Hey, Cindy, great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no, I can't wait to dig in, roll up our sleeves and dig in. And for those of you who don't know Doug, he left a successful career as a trial lawyer to become a peacemaker, which I just love. And his calling is to serve humanity. And he exercises that at many levels. He's an award-winning author, a teacher, a trainer, a highly experienced mediator. And his work carries him from international work to helping people resolve really deep interpersonal and ideological conflicts. And goodness knows we've got a lot of that happening today, from that to training inmates to be peacemakers and mediators in maximum security prisons, which I also just love, Doug. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What made you, I guess, first want to pursue a career as an attorney? and then we'll get to why you left.
Well, it was sort of default. You know, I went to Dartmouth College. I'm a Californian, native California. I went back east to Dartmouth. And in those days, if you weren't pre-med, then you went to law school. I mean, that was kind of the deal. So it was just by default. I graduated, came back to California, took a year off. And then I really went to law school, not knowing if I wanted to be a lawyer, but did know that I wanted to sharpen my thinking.
Yeah.
And I figured the law school would be good for that. So I went to law school, not really kind of knowing what I wanted to do. So, and I did well. I did well academically, ended up clerking for a year after law school, and then went into private practice with a firm here in Central California. And I joined the firm in September of 1978 and tried my first jury trial in November of 78.
Wow. Wow.
That was how my career started.
Baptism by fire.
Really. And then my second case was in December. I second chaired a defense of a $36 million securities fraud case in the Southern District of California down in San Diego. That went for 7 months.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how it started. And, you know, I mean, I went for 5 or 6 years doing that sort of stuff, really not committing myself to it.
Yeah.
And then finally, I just decided, well, if I'm going to do this, I ought to get really good at it.
Yeah.
So I did it. And I was really good at it. I was a commercial and business trial lawyer. Usually I would take on matters that were too complex or difficult that other people didn't want to mess with. And I would take them on. And some cases I would take on that appeared to be impossible, and I'd win them. And, awesome. You know, that was my career for 22 years.
Yeah. It's funny, that kind of baptism, though, it really doesn't give you the space to think or to have any self-introspection at all, right? You just keep going. And I think for a lot of lawyers, I think that happens, and they end up at a point where there's this profound dissatisfaction, and they're not sure where or why. So I'd love if you could share what, when and how, what sort of triggered moving the career to pursue peacemaking.
So in the mid 80s, as a lawyer, when in my 20s and 30s, and even into my early 40s, when I was practicing law, I had two lives. And I think a lot of lawyers are like this. You know, you have your law life, which is very adversarial and competitive. And then you have your other life, which is where your sanity is, right? And one of my great passions was skiing, and I had taught skiing part-time on weekends and holidays at our local resort. And in the skiing instructor hierarchy, there are 3 levels of certification, and I was testing for my 3rd level, and I kept failing my skiing. I passed everything else. Yeah. So I finally decided to take up the martial arts to try to help me overcome some deficiencies I had. And so I did, and I was really bad at it. But like everything else, I'm really bad at it for a long time, and then overnight, I'm really good at it.
Oh, that's great. I love that.
That happened in the martial arts. And finally, I earned my second degree black belt, and my teacher called me in after he awarded me the second degree, and he said, "You're fired. You're an asshole. You're arrogant. You're going to hurt people. You know, I'm not teaching you anything more until you learn Tai Chi."
Oh, wow.
Until you master Tai Chi. Well, that was a death sentence because you never mastered Tai Chi.
Yeah.
But Tai Chi has 2 really interesting paradoxes. The one is the softer you are, the stronger you are.
Okay.
And the other one is the more vulnerable you are, the more powerful you are.
Oh,
soft to be strong, vulnerable to be powerful. And for a hardcore trial lawyer, secondary black belt did not compute.
Yeah.
But I continued to study Tai Chi, and I studied it as a martial art, not as a contemplative practice. And one day, some years later, I was in the courtroom trying a case, and the thought came to me, what the heck am I doing in here? Wow. And after that trial, I had a vacation planned and took off and was on a whitewater trip with a bunch of friends. And I spent 10 days powering through these big rapids all by myself in my raft. Another passion was whitewater. And so I'm a professional guide for a while, and thought about how many people I'd really served as a trial lawyer. How many people had really come out of the system better than going in. And out of the 200 or 300 trials and hearings and stuff that I'd handled over at that time, it would have been about 20 years. I could only count 5 people
Yeah.
that I thought had really benefited. And I said, I don't want to go another 20 or 30 years and only serve 15 people. That's not what my life is about. But I didn't know what I wanted to do. So after that trip, I came back. I was living in the mountains and drove down out of the mountains to my office and heard the one and only public service announcement for a new master's degree in peacemaking and conflict studies being offered at Fresno Pacific University.
Yeah.
And to make a long story short, I enrolled. And for 3 years, I was a full-time graduate student, a 3/4 time law professor, and a full-time trial lawyer.
Wow. Wow. But talk about
And
the universe calling to you, right? You have
it
this
was amazing.
epiphany moment and then you come and boom, there it is. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And these guys, my teachers, were brilliant.
Yeah.
And they taught me, they opened my eyes to things that I had never considered before and thought about. And so I studied human conflict in all its different dimensions and just learned so much.
Yeah, and I'm going to pause you for a sec because I definitely want to get you digging into what that means. Because I think for a lot of people, they hear peacemaking and immediately just think of, international peacekeeping initiatives or whatever. But I wanted to come back and put a pin in a point that you made about those 2 lives as lawyers. Because obviously for our audience out there, for our listeners, I think you're right that a lot of lawyers have that sort of where you've got that adversarial model that we are so conditioned to believe is the only way to practice law. And I found, and I'd love your thoughts on this, that it actually, you'd said about keeping them separate. I think that gets harder and harder to do the longer you practice. And, at first that sort of lawyer mode, if you will, starts, it affects your professional relationships, but then at some point it can start rippling over into those personal relationships and ultimately affect your very sense of self when you're in that constant fight mode. I'd love your thoughts on that, actually, Doug.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And there have been some really interesting books written about how the law profession has been betrayed by all kinds of different factors. And there's no doubt that, one, being a lawyer is hard work. It's a hard, tough way to make a living. And it is, especially if you're a trial lawyer, it's really grueling and difficult. And you're fighting all the time. You're fighting with your client over bills to get paid. You're fighting with the adversaries, of course, opposing counsel and opposing parties. And you're fighting with your partners over compensation. And you're fighting with the courts to get stuff done. I mean, there's just nothing that isn't a fight.
Yeah.
And it wears on you after a while. And you're right. If as you internalize this stuff, you start bringing it home, and then everything's a fight at home because that's the only way you know how to be. And
absolutely.
it destroys. I can't tell you how many lawyers I know have destroyed their relationships with their families, and they don't have a life other than being a lawyer.
Yeah, it's one of the things that really sort of precipitated for me starting this podcast and these sort of practicing with purpose programs. Because my hope is, most people go into the practice of law because they want to make a difference in the world, right? They want to have some positive good. And as you say, at the end, the net value, even people who are the so-called winners in our adversarial system, they feel like they shot up against Russell Crowe and Gladiator, like you just come out so beaten down by the process. So I'd love for you to go a little deeper about that when you say betrayed by the profession. I haven't read those books. That immediately piqued my interest. So what can you tell us more about that?
There are, let's just take the biggest lie of them all.
Yeah.
The concept of zealous advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
You will not find the word zealous advocacy in any ethical code.
Yeah.
This is the big lie that's been perpetrated on us for multiple generations, and it has destroyed us as a profession. And the concept was that you are, as a lawyer, are obligated to represent a client with zealous advocacy. But what that aphorism doesn't tell you is what the conditions are under which zealous advocacy is appropriate.
Yeah.
And there are 4 conditions that have to be met before you can ethically be a zealous advocate. Number 1, the counsel have to be of equal ability and have equal resources. 2, there has to be an arbiter or a judge to rule, an umpire.
Yeah.
To keep it all fair. And 3, there have to be rules, in this case, rules of evidence, for example, that create a level playing field. And the parties themselves they don't have to be relatively equal, but they have to have equal opportunity.
Yeah.
So basically, zealous advocacy applies only in certain kinds of trials with certain kinds of judges.
Yeah.
And otherwise, the term zealous advocacy does not apply at all. And yet I saw, even when I started practicing in 77, and I saw in the late 70s, early 80s, the rapidly diminishing civility, where lawyers were taking this concept of zealous advocacy, saying, I can do whatever I want. I can be as mean, I can be as dishonest, I can be as aggressive, I can be as unprofessional and unaccommodating as I want to be, because my ethical stance is zealous advocacy.
Yeah.
Utter bullshit.
Yeah.
And
And it
that,
has so profoundly affected the reputation of the profession. I mean,
that's
lawyers
right.
used to be held in esteem, and
That's
now,
right.
and particularly in trial advocacy, for whatever reason, I agree. I found, because I practiced social justice law, and most of it was like doing labor and human rights sort of
Right.
advocacy. And the few times I've had to enter into the civil sort of field, I'm like, wow, there is like no professional courtesy here. It is like, that trial by fire, and just the last person standing. It's just a
Right.
horrible approach. So
So that's the first nail in the coffin. The second nail in the coffin is what happened in law school admissions in the 70s and 80s and ever since then. And that is the LSAT completely changed. The LSAT used to be like a GRE. It was a broad educate. It was an exam that tested your broad education.
yeah.
And if you didn't have a broad liberal education, you weren't going to do well on the LSAT. The idea being that if you wanted to be a lawyer, you had to be well educated in a lot of different areas, because you had to bring a lot of different resources to bear on client problems. Well,
Interesting.
the LSAT changed in 74, 75, and they got rid of all of that stuff. They got rid of the mathematics, they got rid of the social science, they got rid of the history, they got rid of the literature and art and all that basic knowledge,
Yeah.
and simply focused on problem solving and critical thinking.
Yeah.
And the problem with that was that you could no longer tell all you can tell from the LSAT today. The LSAT is a predictor of first year law performance.
Yeah.
That's all it is. And what it did is weed out a lot of people who could have brought a better balance
Yeah, I
to the
agree.
law. And the LSAT filtered for people who are hyper aggressive,
Yeah.
hypercritical thinkers.
Yeah.
And that balance was never restored.
Hmm.
So just to get into law school these days, you've got to be of a personality type and have a mindset that automatically orients you towards adversarial ideology.
Yeah. And then that gets reinforced tenfold throughout the
Well,
education
of course.
process, right?
Then the third problem is in legal education. We've got the ABA standard curriculum has of course goes back to Harvard
Yeah.
in the 1880s. And it's based on this casebook method where we read appellate decisions from judges going back into merry old England, right? The old English common law.
Yeah.
But think about what professors who put those casebooks together were looking for: the most perverse,
Yes.
weird, difficult decisions that were highly adversarial.
Yeah.
And we are, from the first day of law school, we were spoon-fed this adversarial idea that it's a winner and a loser. And, we are completely detached from the emotions and the humans and the humanity of the conflict. And everything becomes abstracted into legal principle.
Yeah.
And our humanity is pounded out of us.
Yes.
And what I found is that it takes about 30 or 40 years of practice to regain your humanity as a lawyer, for the most part. Now, I'm not talking about everybody, but the vast majority of lawyers are looking at human conflict as this abstract concept that we pigeonhole everything into these buckets. And the last problem is that as our society has become more complex and more diversified, there are more and more conflicts that are arising out of the ambiguity, the complexity of life, and of course, around all these diverse values that we see.
Yeah.
And there are no systems in place for people to deal with their differences and their conflicts other than the legal system. And so when somebody's offended by something, what's the first thing they do? They go find the meanest junkyard lawyer they can find and file a lawsuit, even though the lawsuit is total BS. And, the lawyer files the lawsuit probably unethically. And now we have all these junk cases going through the courts that the courts are not well equipped to sort out. And I think what people don't realize is that, number one, our judicial system is not about justice. It's about decision making. And there's no guarantee of substantive justice.
Yes.
The aspiration is for procedural justice, due process. That's an aspiration. But there's no aspiration of substantive justice. And the courts can handle certain kinds of cases extremely efficiently, but everything else, they're not equipped to deal with.
Yeah.
I mean, take divorce, for example. That
I
probably
was just going to say that, because it can end up being
50 to 60%.
counterproductive. You've got,
Right, 50% of the caseload or 60% of the caseload of any county in the United States is probably family law.
Yeah.
And the courts are horribly ill-equipped to deal with family law, because it's not about the law, it's about the people.
Yeah.
And we lawyers who become family law judges are ill-equipped to deal with the kinds of problems that people present, and try to make these legal decisions, sometimes almost impossible decisions, especially around custody and parenting and stuff like that. And there's no good solution.
And it gets compounded exponentially because you've got this junkyard dog mentality,
There you
right?
go. The adversary mentality.
Zealous
it.
representation without, I mean, I've seen couples who go looking for an amicable resolution to their divorce and the lawyers get engaged. And next thing you know, I mean, things are just
Right.
going off the
World War
rails.
III.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So these are all the factors that I think have led to, law as a betrayed profession.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Really
some of them
interesting.
are systemic, some of them are cultural, some of them are the evolution of how the law has progressed. And it's sad. It's certainly why I don't practice law
Yeah.
anymore.
Well, and I am optimistic we can change because again, I mean, I've been practicing a long time now, and my hope is through that, the more we talk about this, I think the more we raise that awareness, and especially with the younger generation coming in, I think they're looking for a new way of being. COVID, I think, and hope has really escalated people wanting to think differently about how we show up in life. So fingers crossed, there's some optimism.
Well, it's going to have to change. It's going to have to start with the ABA, and the ABA is a trade. I mean, the ABA group that controls the curriculum.
Yeah.
And accredits law schools is really a trade union for law professors.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And they are bound and determined to protect tenure and protect law professors and protect the curriculum. And heaven help you if you bring in multidisciplinary ideas into the law. You'll see multidisciplinary work around the periphery in some law reviews, but most professors, are stuck with the core 13 course curriculum. And, that curriculum has not changed since the 30s at the earliest, So we need to change the way we teach law, and we need to change the curriculum. And that's not going to happen with the ABA the way it's currently constituted.
Yeah, although I mean, hopefully, I think there's going to be some pressure for that, right? And there will be, in the same way we had an evolution going in the wrong direction. Hopefully, we'll start to see an evolution coming back.
Yeah, I'd like to think that I'm the chair of the board of trustees of our local law school, and we track these things pretty closely. It's you get to feel pretty a lot of despair over 40 years of watching.
Yeah, the same problems.
Change.
Yeah, well, and if anything, worsening, right? I mean, we're lean. We reward that adversary, and even myself, to be honest, when I started the practice law, I remember taking a negotiation course in law school, and I won virtually every simulated negotiation. But I wasn't. When I looked back in hindsight, I was coming from a total place of collaboration. What do you need? What can we get? That empathy and rapport building. You had 50 minutes to get that deal, or you got a zero. But then I started the practice of law, and your rewards come when you're ripping the other party apart. So you're like, oh, I guess that must be the way we need to do it, right? So tell me about peacemaking. What does that mean for you? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I've sort of evolved my thinking around it. As I studied back in the mid to late 1990s, working on my master's degree, I realized that human conflict is multidimensional. It's very complex. And the idea of peacemaking is not just resolving a dispute like you would with a settlement conference or a distributive mediation, which is sort of the way cases are settled these days. It's also looking at the relationships and thinking about how can the relationship be restored? How can there be reconciliation? How do we prevent this wrong from occurring again? So I think peacemaking takes a much broader perspective of what the problem is and what the solution should look like, as opposed to the very narrow perspective of it's just a distributive negotiation and an exchange of money, which is what most mediations are. And in the beginning, when I first started mediating, I did my first mediation in 1981 as a very young lawyer, but there was a lot of openness to doing joint sessions and having people talk and listen to each other and try to understand each other. And that quickly went by the wayside for a number of different reasons. One, most mediators are not well trained. You can call yourself a mediator with no training. And if you want to get court annexed, you get 40 hours of training. And and that training is not even basic. It's not even kindergarten. And so when mediators, or especially older mediators, were confronted with highly emotional disputes, it frightened them, anxiety, and they either blew the joint session or they immediately went into caucus. And lawyers started wanting to go into caucus because they were not emotionally competent people. Very few lawyers are emotionally competent, and so they were anxious around the emotions. And they wanted to control everything. And so they felt that caucus-based process could work. So by late 1990s, early 2000s, there was almost no joint sessions being done. And so it just became a distributive negotiation. Now, I happen to do a lot of non-litigated disputes. I do family business conflicts, corporate disputes, organizational disputes, congregational disputes, stuff where there's just no way you can go to a court for this sort of stuff. And in all of those kinds of cases, we never caucus.
Mhm.
It's all joint session.
That is a really interesting observation because, and I'm just thinking over my practice as well, not surprisingly, doing social justice and anti-discrimination work, there were a lot of mediations, right? Labor arbitration, tons of mediation work. And I can probably count on one hand in 30 years of practice the number of times that these full-time professional mediators had us in the same room where you can look to restore the relationship. It's always immediately get each to your own, like separate rooms down the hall. And
Right.
the other thing that's interesting to me as you're saying that, I'm thinking about like First Nations, I mean, these were principles that they were applying thousands of years ago. They had that kind of
Well,
restorative
be
justice.
careful about that.
So,
Got to be careful not that we don't over romanticize Indigenous peacemaking practices.
yes,
Some did, many did not. Most of them
yes.
were violent.
Yeah, this is
So we have to be very careful about that. But you're right. And these professional mediators like myself, who have been practicing for a long time, are doing the same thing they did 30 years ago.
yeah.
They've
Yeah.
never gone back to, I go to conferences and mostly I teach at conferences, and I never, it's so interesting to see who doesn't show up and who is not out there learning new skills. I'm on the faculty at Pepperdine, and before COVID, we had the professional skills program in the summer, and I've taught there for many, many years. I still do. And now my graduate classes have been online recently. Maybe I'll be back in Malibu next year, who knows?
Yeah.
But it's always interesting to see who is not there, and who's not there are the big name mediators, and they are not getting trained in the latest thinking and the latest stuff.
Yeah, good point.
And so they're successful. They have a reputation. They just do what they've always done, but they're really not improving their practice, and they're comfortable separating people into caucus rooms and doing that sort of thing, and it works for them.
Yeah.
But they miss a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, and it doesn't improve the process, right? If we don't change. So
Correct.
So I know, Doug, you also do some teaching in prisons with inmates as your students. I'd love if you could talk about that. Like, what do you hope is the biggest takeaway? How do you approach that? What's been your experience with that?
That has been probably the most rewarding and satisfying work of my life.
Wow.
It started in 2010. Actually, it started with a letter in 2009 when my dear friend and colleague, mediator Laurel Coffer out of Los Angeles, called me one day and read a letter from a woman who was serving a life sentence without possibility of parole in the largest, most violent women's prison in the world, asking if Laurel would come in and teach the networking group, which was composed of about 150 women serving life sentences, to be mediators and peacemakers at Valley State Prison for Women in California, because they were tired of the violence.
Yeah.
And Laurel got the letter, read it, called me, read it to me, said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I think we should do this." And so we got permission and we decided that we're both professors and both done mediation training. And we said, we can't do mediation training like everybody else. This has to be completely different because we're dealing with a population of students that probably have zero skills. So we devised a really innovative and unique curriculum and started in April of 2010 with 15 women. And we were shocked at how effective it was. By the time we were 6 weeks through our first 12-week curriculum in that prison of 3,600 women, we had 1,000 women signed up on a wait list.
Wow.
Within 6 weeks, people heard about the program and wanted to get involved. And so we worked in that prison for 3 years. This was all pro bono. We weren't paid. We were paying for everything out of our own pocket. Then the prison was repurposed into a men's prison. We followed the women to the two other women's institutions in California and were successful in establishing prison of peace in one of them. And the other one, we weren't successful. Although we're going back this year, amazingly enough, which is great. But then VSPW became VSP, Valley State Prison, and that was a men's prison. And we never worked with men, of course. And ultimately, despite trepidations, we said, okay, we'll come in and work with the men. And we did. And it was just as successful as with the women.
Yeah.
So, but then it was 2016. Again, we had been doing this now for 6 years, totally pro bono. We basically ruined our professional practices because we put all our time into all of this. And we were about ready to give up because we didn't have any money. And the state started awarding grants, and we got some big grants. So today we're in 15 California prisons.
Wow.
14 prisons in Greece. We're funded in Connecticut. We started in one prison in Connecticut in 2018. Of course, COVID stopped everything, but now we're set up and we'll probably be in the entire Connecticut prison system, which is about 1/10 of the size of California. And we've got, like I said, we're international. We've got 14 prisons in Greece. We've got startups in Italy and in Nairobi.
That's incredible.
And what's really cool is that because of COVID, of course, all in-person programming shut down for 2.5 years, but we have spent the last year and a half filming our entire curriculum, 80 hours of curriculum.
Yeah.
It's now all on DVD. We're just in the final post-production phases of the project. And later this summer, it will be available worldwide. It'll be subtitled in 50 different languages.
Wow.
And it'll be available around the world to anybody who is willing to do the hard work of bringing prison of peace to their prison. And it'll be available for prisons, for reentry programs, domestic relations shelters, places like that.
And what do you attribute the success to for that, Doug? Like, that's pretty remarkable success. So what would you say are the key factors that make the program so successful?
Well, we have a really, really unique curriculum. And so I think there are a couple of things that have made the program successful. One, Laurel and I are really good teachers. And two, we're extremely pragmatic in the way that we teach. We ground everything in science.
Yeah.
There's nothing we don't teach that we can't say, here's the science that supports why we're teaching it. And I'm talking neuroscience.
Yeah.
And we're extremely honest with our incarcerated students. We hold them to high standards of accountability, and we make them work really hard, and everything we teach works.
Yeah.
So even though they're initially skeptical, when they actually go out and start doing the work, doing the exercises, doing peace circles, listening, working on making durable agreements, results-based listening, how to give advice without giving advice, all these different skills that we teach leading up to the mediation workshop. And they start to see that this stuff works, and it completely changes not only their lives in their prison communities, but also their relationships with their families outside.
Yeah.
That, they become super motivated to learn more and more and more, and the word spreads. This is, people in prison have really good BS detectors, and
Yeah.
they're skeptical of two older lawyers coming in teaching this kind of stuff, and all of a sudden the word gets out, hey, these guys are the real deal.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. Part of it too is we always show up, and being extremely accountable and responsible and consistent. We show up. If we say we're going to be there, we're there.
Yeah.
And that is rare for the incarcerated people to experience.
Yeah.
They don't experience that kind of consistency. And we say, we're here, we're your teachers, your mentors. If we say we're going to be here, we're going to be here. And even if we can't get in because there's a lockdown, we'll tell you we're at the gate waiting to get in. And that builds loyalty and trust.
Of course. Yeah. Now, do you have any transferable sort of tips that you could give for our lawyers, our listening audience out there as well, about some skills from your programming that they could maybe start thinking about or applying in their practice? Anything you can share that would be helpful in that?
Well, there are a lot of skills, but nothing that can be distilled down in 30 seconds or less. Because, depending upon what kind of a practice you have, you have to decide what you want. What do you really want to be? Do you want to be a person of service?
Yeah.
Or are you just there to represent people, and they're just only, the cases are all the same, just the name changes, like you got a defense person in your practice or a plaintiff's person in your practice, and the names come and go. That kind of practice is, to me, is sort of soul draining, but it can be financially remunerative, I suppose. So I guess it really depends on the kind of practice you have. If you're a problem solver, if you like to do problem solving and really solve problems and help people, and there are lots of skills that you can learn that we teach that could be really useful, that are never taught in law school or taught in CLE courses. So I think it really depends on the kind of practice you have and what you want to do with your life as a lawyer.
And what are the skills that you would think are missing now, or certainly for any of our young lawyers out there who are listening, what are some skills that you would suggest that they really get intentional about honing?
Well, I think that probably the greatest drawback to legal education and to being a young lawyer is not learning about emotions. Mm-hmm. We've been lied to for 4,000 years. And this is something that will be very shocking for lawyers.
Yeah.
We've been told that what makes us human is rationality. Yeah. And this goes back 4,000 years or more. And the truth of the matter is, we're not rational beings. We're emotional beings. There's no such thing as rationality. I teach a course called Decision-Making Under Stress and Conflict at Pepperdine. And the first thing that I teach my students is there's no such thing as rationality. This idea of rational thinking is a complete myth. We are 98% emotional. And if there is such a thing as rationality, maybe we can do it 2% of the time. Yeah. But every decision we make is an emotional decision. And it's all based on how it's either we're going to feel good or we're going to avoid feeling bad, and that's all. It's all emotional decision making, and then we justify it through critical thinking processes. And in fact, that's the way that many judges or arbitrators will decide cases. They'll say, what makes me feel good about this case? They'll decide. They'll make an emotional decision about how they want the case to come out, and then they'll go back and just find the logic and the logic.
So true. Yeah.
So I would tell a young lawyer, Spend time learning about emotions, learn how to affect label, learn how to listen to and reflect back the emotions of other people, learn about the neuroscience of emotions, learn about neuroeconomics, how we go about how the brain actually processes information and makes decisions. It's completely different. It's as radically different from the assumptions that the law makes about human nature as you can possibly imagine.
That's so true.
There's no such thing as a reasonable person. And so the law is premised on this idea of rationality, that human beings act on a rational basis, and they don't. In fact, the law is so divorced from reality that even economists today, even in classical economics, there's no such thing as rationality.
Yeah.
The rational choice theory that was put forth by von Neumann and Morgenstern back in 1943 has been completely discredited. And rational choice theory is it's an economic theory of rational choice, only used to study economic decision making under perfect conditions, which never exist. And so I would tell lawyers, go study neuropsychology and study what humans really are, not what the law says they should be. And that will give you insights that will help you in client counseling, help you select juries, help you develop effective cross-examinations, all this stuff. Well, I sure wish I'd known what I know now, 40 years ago.
I think that's such great advice, because we're not taught that, certainly during, or at least I don't know today, you would know better than I do, but certainly that was nowhere on the horizon when I went to law school. And such an important, our entire legal system is based on comparing to the reasonable man, right? I mean, so many.
And there's no such thing as a reasonable man. It's all based on a lie.
Good. Yeah, that's beautiful. And what tips would you have for lawyers out there about how to get away from that sort of traditional competitive, soul-sucking, constant fight mode of practicing, to find a way to, for those lawyers who want to stay, to practice more on purpose?
I told my clients never to do, right? So I was finishing up my master's degree in 2000, and my partners and I had been having a lot of discussions about what my practice would look like. I didn't want to try court cases anymore. I wanted to become a problem solver and a peacemaker. And I thought there would be a high demand for that, but we were a bankruptcy litigation firm, and many of my partners just couldn't get their heads around it. And so finally one day, the managing partner of the firm, who was my peer, I graduated from law school the same year, came in one Friday and said, "You're not getting any more paychecks until you quit this peacemaking shit."
Wow.
He had no authority to do that.
Wow.
And they'd taken me out of a partner office and kicked me into a paralegal studio, and my secretary retired, and firm didn't replace my secretary, and they were just trying to pressure me to conform. I went home over the weekend with my first wife, and we talked it over and did some numbers. And I came back on Monday morning and walked in, called the managing partner into the firm manager's office, and took out my credit cards, my cell phone and keys and everything else. I said, "I quit. I'll be gone on Friday."
Wow.
I left $10 million on the table, $10 million more that I put in the firm than I took out. I was a big earner, and they were shocked. They couldn't believe that I was willing to walk away from a 22-year-old successful trial career, making millions of dollars, and just walk out with nothing. And I just had it. And I think that it takes that kind of courage and disgustedness, I think, to have you kick down the door of the gilded cage.
Yeah.
Because if you are a successful lawyer, you're making a good living, you don't know what else you can do, and you're trapped and unhappy and miserable. Well, let me tell you something. There are a million things you can do with a law degree other than being a lawyer. And I would tell people, find something that you're really passionate about and follow your passion. And don't worry about the money. And that's hard for people to do when they've got kids that are in college, and they've got a big house, and they've got a big mortgage, and they've got big cars, and they're in debt up to their yin yang, and which is what happens to a lot of people. And today, but get through that. I had a big house, I had a big car, I had all that stuff. Today I've got 10 acres. I live just south of Yosemite National Park in one of the most beautiful parts of the country. I've got a 2013 Subaru with 175,000 miles on it. I don't plan on replacing it anytime soon. And,
nice.
I live in a small home, 1,100 square feet, just the basic house itself. We've got other outbuildings, but we're totally solarized. It has a wall, and, I don't have a utility bill, and the only debt we've got is against the mortgage against the house. And
beautiful.
If you can simplify your life, you don't need all that stuff. I used to think that stuff was really important. I just dreamed about all that, when I get there and I have all this, I will have really made it.
Yeah.
No.
And yet it's never enough, right? That's the
And it's
other,
never enough
is it will
because
never be enough. Yeah,
that's right. And the reason is you're filling the emptiness inside.
absolutely.
And that emptiness inside is a black hole.
Yeah.
And what you have to do is heal yourself. And you
Mhm.
have to heal that hole. You have to really learn to be authentic and really be true to yourself and heal that hole. Then making choices becomes really easy after that.
Yeah. Because
And
otherwise
people
you're
around
stuck.
you will think you're crazy because they can't believe that you're abandoning
Yeah.
this life for something different.
Yeah. They think
But
it's a midlife
life is
crisis.
so much happier.
Yeah.
I've never been happier than I am. I'm 71 years old. I've never been happier.
Oh my God, you look fantastic. Good grief.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing, you see. You get out of this grind and you can start taking care of yourself.
Yes.
I'm 71 chronologically, but biologically, I'm more like 55.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I
And
love that, heal yourself. I think that's such beautiful advice. And most lawyers, we don't talk that way. We don't think that way. We have the golden handcuff syndrome where people feel that there's no alternative, right?
that's
So,
right. But there are.
yeah.
And you just have to have the courage to say, no, I'm not going to do this anymore.
Yeah.
And you can still be a lawyer. I'm a lawyer, still pay my state bar dues and do all that stuff. But I serve in really interesting ways. I just got an email from our local court. Now, I haven't been involved with our local courts in decades, and yet they know me. And they call, would you be willing to come down and train our judicial officers in de-escalation strategies, especially those that have got assignments to family law?
Nice.
Of course I'll do it.
Yeah.
You know?
Beautiful.
So I can serve.
And see, there is hope for change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You just
Yeah.
have to have the courage to do it.
Yeah.
And you
But
have
I
to,
mean, even
you have to
within the system.
not value the extrinsic.
Yeah.
You have to value
Yeah.
the internal.
But that gives me hope, actually, even that they're bringing you in, because obviously that represents a shift, right? A small shift in that sort of mindset. So
Yeah, I've given up. I've basically given
Yeah.
up on those people. I mean, I did the very first adult restorative justice program in the United States in our local courts, and
Yeah.
phenomenal success, and it
Yeah.
went nowhere. And
yeah, it's
I'm
there's going to be a lot of
tired
resistance.
of pounding my head against the wall.
I hear you. Well, thank you so much. This has been such an interesting discussion. I can't believe how quickly our time has gone together. So thanks so much for joining us and sharing here, Doug. And I normally love to end by asking, what is one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've ever had in your life? It can be on this issue or anything, but one of those aha moments where everything kind of shifts for you.
Probably the first time that I really accepted and embraced emotional pain at a deep level. And it was a really profound experience that began my journey of healing. And it's something that we all avoid, because from the childhood on, we've got all this pain. Oh, we're alone and scared and frightened and don't feel worthy and feel awful. And, and we're trained that emotions are bad. So experiencing, we repress our emotions, suppress them. And lawyers are really good at numbing out and bifurcating, taking our emotions and stuffing them back somewhere we don't have to process them. Eventually that comes back to bite you. And I was in a situation where I finally realized I couldn't suppress anything. And if I really wanted to become the person that I wanted to become, I had to dive into that cesspool and really experience all of that pain at a deep level. And I did. And I came out just fine. And that's what started, that's when my healing really started.
Yeah. Actually, that's beautiful. I've never had anybody share that. And I think that really resonated with me, because we avoid, and as lawyers, I think humans generally, and lawyers in particular,
Correct.
avoid facing those emotions like the plague. So that's a beautiful mindset shift and insight for all of us. So thank you for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure. Yeah. And for our listeners out there, if you want to learn more about Doug, make sure you can check out his website at dougnoll.com. That's Noll. We'll make sure to put this in the show notes for you as well. Check him out on LinkedIn at Doug Noll, or on Facebook at Douglas Noll as well. And I'm sure you have all just got loads of value and insights from this episode. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already done so, and share this with anyone that you think could get some value. And this has been a really interesting and unique perspective here. So I really invite you guys, share it broadly. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and try and find ways that you can practice on purpose. Find a better way to practice law so that you can rekindle your passion and go back to making a difference in the world, negotiating your best life on your terms. Until next time, take care.